The Atlantic dawn unfurled over Virginia Beach like molten gold spilling across wet sand and silent training grounds. Salt wind carried the bite of the sea and the unspoken weight of discipline as SEAL candidates stood shoulder-to-shoulder, breath rising in pale clouds in the cold morning air. It was 600 hours, one of those mornings that feels ordinary right up until it isn't. At the edge of the formation stood a Navy SEAL, with a weathered calm in his eyes, a man shaped by war and restraint, while beside him a German shepherd waited in perfect stillness. Muscles, coiled ears alert, loyalty sharper than steel. No one there yet understood that before the sun reached its peak, pride would be tested, lines would be crossed, and a quiet miracle would unfold where discipline, courage, and faith collided. If stories of courage, loyalty, and moments where God's hand moves quietly but powerfully speak to your heart, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps these stories reach others who need hope today. The Atlantic lay flat and watchful over Virginia Beach, a pale silver sheet under low clouds, as if the sea itself had paused to listen before deciding what kind of day this would become. Ethan Walker had learned long ago to read mornings the way other men read faces. At 32, the Navy SEAL moved with a quiet economy, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by years of saltwater sand and orders given at dawn. His dark hair was kept regulation short, but his beard trimmed never soft cast, sharp lines along a jaw that looked as if it had been carved by repeated decisions under pressure. There was an old scar near his left eyebrow, pale and thin, the remnant of shrapnel from a night operation off the coast of Yemen, a night that had taught him how quickly control could slip away and how permanently it could change a man. Since then, Ethan carried himself with restraint, calm on the surface, while a constant internal vigilance ran beneath like a current that never slept. At his side walked Shadow, a German shepherd just past 4 years old. Massive without being bulky, his black and tan coat dense and glossy even in the early light. Shadow's ears stood high alert and his amber eyes missed nothing. He had been trained for precision, not aggression. His movements were fluid, his power held in reserve. Ethan often thought of him not as a dog, but as a conscience, with teeth silent, loyal, incapable of betrayal. Shadow had been with Ethan during the worst night of his career, the night an extraction went wrong and gunfire came from the wrong direction. The dog had dragged Ethan behind cover after a blast knocked him flat, refusing to release his sleeve even when bullets cracked overhead. Since then, Ethan trusted Shadow with his life more easily than he trusted most men. They reached the edge of the training grounds as the first groups of candidates assembled. The men were young, strong, loud in the way that came from fear disguised as confidence. Ethan observed them without judgment, noting posture, breath, the way some avoided eye contact with Shadow while others stared too long. Fear and arrogance were equally dangerous. He'd buried friends who had carried both. A new presence cut through the morning rhythm. Logan Pierce approached from the opposite end of the field, boots striking sand with deliberate emphasis. Pierce was 33, taller than Ethan by a fraction, built thick through the chest and arms, his blond hair cut high and tight. His face was clean-shaven, angular, handsome, in a cold, symmetrical way, but his eyes were restless, constantly measuring, always looking for hierarchy. He smiled easily, too easily, and the smile never quite reached his eyes. Pierce had come with a visiting unit for joint training, and his reputation had arrived ahead of him. Excellent operator, questionable discipline, a man who believed rules were suggestions meant for others. "Morning, Pierce," said, voice smooth, carrying just far enough to draw attention. His gaze flicked to Shadow, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Didn't realize the Navy let pets run drills now. A few candidates chuckled nervously. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not anger exactly, but recognition. He had met this type before, men who mistook dominance for strength and restraint for weakness. Years ago, Ethan might have answered with sharp words. Now he simply rested his hand on Shadow's collar, a subtle grounding gesture. The dog remained still, eyes forward, unbothered. "Shadow isn't a pet," Ethan replied evenly. His voice was low, steady, shaped by command without needing volume. "He's trained to save lives, mine included." Pierce raised his hands in mock surrender, the smile widening. "Relax, just a joke." But his eyes hardened for a split second, a flash of something darker, contempt perhaps, or the discomfort of being corrected in public. As Pierce walked on, Ethan felt the weight of old lessons press against him. Leadership, he knew, was not about humiliating another man, even when that man deserved it. It was about choosing which battles mattered. Still, something about Pierce unsettled him the way a storm unsettles animals long before thunder sounds. Ethan knelt briefly, bringing his face level with Shadow's. The dog's breath was warm, steady grounding. "Easy." Ethan murmured more to himself than to the dog. Shadow's tail gave a single slow wag as if acknowledging a shared understanding. Whatever this day held, they would face it together. As the sun struggled higher behind the clouds, Ethan stood and scanned the horizon. He had come back to training duty after his injury, believing this assignment would be quieter, safer. Yet the ocean's stillness told him otherwise. Some days didn't announce their danger loudly. Some days whispered first. And Ethan Walker had learned to listen. The day warmed slowly, the low clouds thinning but refusing to leave, casting Virginia Beach in a muted gray that softened edges without hiding anything. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of the mat inside the training facility, arms folded, posture relaxed but deliberate. The building smelled of rubber flooring, salt carried in from the ocean, and sweat earned honestly. This was familiar, ground-controlled, predictable in a way combat never was. Yet his instincts remained sharp, stirred by the presence of men who were not his to shape. Shadow lay at his feet, sphinx-like massive paws tucked neatly beneath his chest. Up close, the German shepherd's age showed in the faint silver threading the black along his muzzle, a sign of experience rather than decline. His breathing was slow, measured, ears pivoting independently as voices echoed across the room. Shadow had learned patience the hard way. His first handler had been killed in a roadside blast overseas, and the dog had waited beside the wreckage until help arrived. That loss had etched something permanent into him, a steadiness that mirrored Ethan's own. The visiting unit assembled opposite the SEAL candidates. Logan Pierce stood at the front shoulders, squared hands resting casually on his hips, as if the room already belonged to him. In better light, Ethan noticed the fine scar that ran from Pierce's collarbone toward his shoulder, a souvenir from a firefight in Helmand Province, if rumors were true. Injuries like that often shaped a man's temperament. Some learned humility, others learned entitlement. Pierce had chosen the latter. "All right," Ethan said, his voice carrying without effort. "Today isn't about ego. It's about control. Yours first, then the situation." Pierce smirked faintly but said nothing. His men followed his lead, attentive yet visibly skeptical. The session began with partner drills, balance disruption, joint control transitions from standing to ground without unnecessary force. Ethan demonstrated each movement slowly, explaining the mechanics, the why behind the how. He believed deeply that understanding bred restraint, and restraint saved lives. Shadow moved when signaled, circling, stopping, applying pressure without biting, then disengaging cleanly. The candidates watched closely, some with fascination, others with unease. A new figure entered quietly from the side door. Sarah Mitchell paused just inside, clipboard in hand. She was 35, tall and lean, with dark brown hair pulled into a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her eyes. Her skin was weathered by years of sun and salt, her posture military precise. Sarah had once been an operations psychologist embedded with special warfare units before transitioning into training oversight after a near-fatal vehicle rollover in Iraq. The accident had left her with a slight limp and a fierce intolerance for reckless bravado. She observed without interrupting her gaze, flicking between Ethan and Pierce, noting micro-expressions most men never realized they showed. Midway through the drills, Pierce stepped forward. "Mind if I try that sequence?" he asked, tone polite enough to pass inspection. Ethan nodded. Go ahead. Pierce paired himself against one of Ethan's candidates, a broad-shouldered young man who outweighed him by 20 pounds. Pierce moved aggressively, overpowering rather than redirecting, forcing the maneuver through raw strength. The result was effective, but sloppy. The candidate winced, elbow bent too far. Ethan raised a hand. Stop. Pierce released his partner with a shrug. Worked, didn't it? It did, Ethan agreed calmly. And it would have dislocated his joint in a real scenario. Efficiency isn't domination, it's precision. A ripple of tension moved through the room. Pierce's jaw tightened. In the field, you don't always get precision. No, Ethan said, but you always get consequences. Silence followed, heavy and instructive. Shadow stood without command, positioning himself subtly between Ethan and Pierce, not threatening, simply present. Pierce noticed. His eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan, something unreadable passing across his face. Sarah finally spoke. We're here to reduce injuries, not compare resumes, she said evenly. Her voice carried authority, earned rather than claimed. Pierce inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her without conceding anything. The rest of the session continued under a tight professionalism. Pierce complied, learned, but his attention drifted off into Shadow, studying the dog with a look that mixed curiosity and resentment. Ethan felt it like a low vibration under his skin. He'd seen men fixate like that before, on symbols, on perceived slights. When the session ended, the room emptied quickly. Pierce lingered near the door, exchanging a few quiet words with his men before leaving. As he passed Ethan, he stopped just long enough to murmur, "Interesting setup you've got. Dog makes a strong impression." "So should discipline," Ethan replied. Pierce smiled thinly and walked on. Sarah approached once they were alone. "You handled that well," she said. "But be careful. Men who feel corrected don't always let it go." Ethan nodded, glancing down at Shadow, who had settled again at his side. "I know." As the lights dimmed and the ocean's distant roar seeped back into the building, Ethan felt certainty settle in his chest. This assignment was no longer just about training. Something had been set in motion, subtle but unavoidable, and Shadow, alert and silent, seemed to agree. The evening settled over Virginia Beach with a deceptive calm. The sky bruised purple and blue as wind slid low across the base, carrying the ocean's breath into every shadowed corridor and parking lot. Ethan Walker stayed late, the kind of late that came from responsibility rather than paperwork. He reviewed footage from the afternoon drills, rewinding moments where posture slipped or timing faltered his mind, parsing patterns the way it had learned to do after Yemen, after the blast that had knocked him sideways and left him listening to his own heartbeat through grit and smoke. The injury had healed into a stiff reminder under his left shoulder blade, a place that flared when his guard dropped. He didn't let it. Shadow lay nearby, chin on paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. The dog's patience was not sleep but readiness learned from loss and reinforced by trust. When Ethan finally shut down the monitor, the building felt emptied of voices, yet full of echoes like a church after a storm. Outside, sodium lights cast halos on wet pavement. Ethan crossed the lot with Shadow, heeling close leash slack, the distance to his truck measured in breaths. He felt it before he heard it, the hum under the quiet, the same hum that preceded trouble overseas. A laugh drifted from the far row, too loud for the hour, followed by boots scuffing concrete. Logan Pierce stepped into the light with two of his men trailing a pace behind. Up close, Pierce's features sharpened, the straight nose slightly bent from a break that hadn't set perfectly, the mouth habitually curling at one corner, as if the world were an inside joke. He moved with confidence burnished by years of being indulged, a confidence that curdled when checked. "Didn't expect to see you still here," Pierce said, hands open, voice casual. The faint smell of alcohol rode the air, not enough to excuse anything, just enough to loosen edges. Ethan stopped, body angled, not squared. "Long day," he replied. "Neutral, clear." Pierce's gaze dropped to Shadow. "Dog did good today," he said. "Impressive control. Makes a statement." "Control isn't a statement," Ethan said. It's a responsibility. One of Pierce's men shifted Jared Mills' mid-twenties narrow-face eyes, darting a follower who laughed when told and stopped when ordered. The other, Marcus Hale, older and thicker through the neck, carried himself with a quiet unease. He'd seen enough to recognize a bad turn before it completed. Hale's jaw worked as if he wanted to speak. Pierce stepped closer, crowding the space that didn't belong to him. "You ever think," he said softly, "that some people hide behind rules? Behind dogs?" Shadow rose without a sound, placing himself between them. Not aggressive, just present. His amber eyes fixed on Pierce, ears forward, a low vibration in his chest, like a warning bell. Ethan's hand came up, not to restrain, but to communicate. Shadow held. A door slammed somewhere across the lot. The sound snapped the moment like a twig. Pierce smiled thinly, recognizing witnesses where none stood. "Relax," he said. "Just making conversation." "That's enough," Ethan replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. From the edge of the light, another figure approached. Officer Daniel Reyes, base security, late 30s, compact build, dark hair peppered with gray mustache, trimmed to regulation. Reyes had a habit of noticing what others missed, an instinct honed after a car bomb had taken his partner years back. He carried himself with quiet authority and a practiced neutrality that came from enforcing rules among men who hated being corrected. "Evening," Reyes said, tone even. "Everything all right?" Pierce lifted his hands again theatrically. "All good, officer. We were just heading out." Reyes's eyes flicked to Shadow, then to Ethan, then back to Pierce, cataloging. "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way." Pierce nodded, the smile gone, now replaced by something flatter. As he turned, he glanced once more at Shadow, long enough to be a promise rather than a look. Hale hesitated, met Ethan's eyes, and gave a small apologetic tilt of the head before following. Reyes waited until they were gone. "You okay?" he asked. Ethan exhaled, the tension easing by degrees. "Yes." Reyes nodded. "If that changes, call it in early." "Not after." He tipped his chin at Shadow. "Good dog." Shadow's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. Driving home along the coast road, Ethan replayed the encounter with the same ruthless honesty he brought to after-action reports. Pierce hadn't crossed a legal line. Not yet. But lines had a way of humming before they were touched, like wires under load. At home, Ethan fed. Shadow checked paws, brushed sand from the thick coat that caught the light like polished onyx. He paused at the scar near Shadow's flank, a pale crescent from shrapnel, proof that courage had a cost and survival required cooperation. That night, sleep came in fragments. Ethan dreamed of the ocean holding its breath again, of a hum that grew louder until it became a roar. Shadow slept beside the bed, one ear cocked, guarding a man who knew tomorrow would demand clarity. Morning would come, and with it, choices. Rain arrived without ceremony, a thin, relentless curtain sweeping across Virginia Beach, turning lights into blurred halos and making every footstep sound louder than it should. Ethan Walker woke before his alarm the way he always did when something unresolved pressed against his instincts. The room was dark, the steady rhythm of rain tapping the window like a code he almost understood. Shadow lifted his head from the floor beside the bed, amber eyes already fixed on Ethan, ears tilting forward in silent question. At 4 years old, the German Shepherd had grown into a creature of quiet power, muscles dense under thick black and tan fur movements, economical scars faint but telling if one knew where to look. Shadow did not bark. He never barked without reason. Instead, he waited, trusting Ethan to interpret the world first. The base was quieter than usual that morning, rain driving most activity indoors. Ethan arrived early, reviewing schedules, adjusting patrol routes for the weather. He felt the tension from the previous night still coiled in his chest, not fear but anticipation, the knowledge that when lines began to hum, they rarely settled on their own. Sarah Mitchell joined him in the operations office, setting her clipboard down with a sigh that carried fatigue rather than weakness. In the fluorescent light, her sharp features looked harder. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes deepened by years of watching men make the same mistakes in different uniforms. Her limp was more pronounced in the cold, but she ignored it as she always did. "You weren't imagining it," Sarah said, flipping open a folder. "Pierce filed a complaint this morning." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About what hostile training environment? Claims you singled him out. Mentions the dog." Her mouth tightened, irritation flashing through her professional calm. "It won't go anywhere. Too vague. Too convenient." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's not the point." "No," Sarah agreed. "The point is escalation." Before either could say more, the radio on the desk crackled. "Control to Walker. We've got an incident at the South Storage Yard. Possible break-in," K9 requested. Ethan's body moved before his mind finished the thought. He clipped Shadow's harness on the familiar weight settling into his hand like a promise. Sarah watched him, concern flickering across her face. "Be careful," she said quietly. It wasn't a platitude. It was an assessment. The storage yard sat near the edge of the base, a maze of containers and low concrete buildings slick with rain. Floodlights cut through the downpour, illuminating puddles and shadows in equal measure. Officer Daniel Reyes met them at the perimeter, rain plastering his uniform to his compact frame. His mustache was darker with water, his expression grim. "Motion sensors tripped," he said. "Camera feed went dead for about 30 seconds. Long enough to matter." Shadow dropped his nose immediately, tracking with a focus that bordered on reverence. Ethan followed, senses narrowing to rhythm and distance. They moved past stacked crates, water dripping steadily until Shadow froze. A low growl vibrated through his chest, not loud but unmistakable. A figure shifted behind a container. Marcus Hale stepped into the light, hands raised quickly. He looked worse in the rain, mid-30s, broad face lined with exhaustion rather than age. His beard was untrimmed, eyes red-rimmed, carrying the look of a man who hadn't slept because sleep brought too many memories. "I didn't do anything," Hale said, voice tight. "I was trying to stop it. Stop what Reyes asked, already moving to cuff him." Ethan held up a hand. "Wait." Hale swallowed, rain and sweat running together. "Pierce? He said there was gear here that didn't belong on inventory. He wanted proof. I told him it was a bad idea." As if summoned by the admission, another shadow detached from the darkness. Logan Pierce emerged from behind a container, rain sliding off his jacket face, set in a hard smile that never reached his eyes. "This is getting ridiculous," he said. "I was conducting my own check. That's not a crime." Shadow's growl deepened, hackles rising now. Ethan felt it, the shift from warning to readiness. "Stand still," Ethan ordered. "Both of you." Pierce's gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan, calculation replacing bravado. "You going to sick him on me?" he asked, voice edged with contempt and something sharper, fear masked as anger. "Shadow moves when I tell him to," Ethan said. "No one else." Reyes moved in, securing Pierce's wrist. The man resisted just long enough to prove intent, then relaxed, the fight draining out of him. "You don't know what you're stopping," Pierce muttered as cuffs clicked shut. "You think rules protect you." Ethan met his eyes. "They protect everyone else from you." The search that followed turned up enough irregularities to matter: tampered seals, missing logs, evidence that Pierce's curiosity hadn't been academic. Hale slumped against a container once it was over, relief and shame warring on his face. He avoided Ethan's gaze. "I didn't want it to go this far," he said. "Then you did the right thing," Ethan replied. "It wasn't forgiveness. It was truth." As dawn bled pale gray into the rain, Ethan stood with Shadow at the edge of the yard. The hum he'd felt was gone, replaced by something heavier. Decisions had been made, consequences set in motion. This wasn't over. It was only changing shape. And Ethan knew the next chapters would demand more than restraint. They would demand resolve. Morning returned to Virginia Beach gently. The rain rinsed from the sky. Sunlight spreading across the base in clean, deliberate lines, as if the world itself were offering a second chance. Ethan Walker stood on the sand just beyond the training grounds, boots off feet, planted where the ocean reached and retreated in a steady rhythm. At 32, he looked older than his years when still younger when moving. Broad shoulders relaxed, now beard trimmed but softer around the edges. The sharp planes of his face eased by something that hadn't been there before: relief. The events of the night at the storage yard had run their course quickly once the evidence surfaced. Logan Pierce was gone from the base, escorted out before sunrise, his confidence finally collapsing under the weight of his own choices. For the first time in days, the hum inside Ethan's chest had quieted. Shadow splashed at the shoreline a few feet away, his powerful frame transformed by joy. The German shepherd's coat glowed in the morning light, black fur catching gold tan markings warm and rich. At 4 years old, Shadow carried himself with the authority of experience, but now he ran like a younger dog chasing foam, leaping clumsily when waves surprised him. His ears flopped briefly before snapping back upright, and Ethan laughed a low, surprised sound that startled even him. It had been a long time since laughter came without effort. Behind them, Sarah Mitchell approached across the sand, shoes in hand. In daylight, her tall, lean figure looked less severe, the tight bun replaced by a loose braid of dark hair streaked faintly with gray. Her skin bore the marks of years outdoors, sun and wind, carving quiet lines that spoke of endurance. The limp was still there, subtle but honest, a reminder of the roadside explosion in Iraq that had ended one chapter of her life and begun another. She stopped beside Ethan, watching Shadow with an expression that blended fondness and professional satisfaction. "He's earned this," she said. "So have you?" Ethan replied. Sarah smiled, small but genuine. "The investigation wrapped up faster than I expected." Hale gave a full statement. "Turns out he'd been carrying guilt for weeks." She paused, then added, "You did right by him." Ethan nodded. He made a choice when it counted. They stood in companionable silence, the ocean doing the talking. For Sarah, the resolution brought something close to peace. She had spent years studying patterns of behavior, watching how unchecked arrogance turned into harm. Seeing accountability, not just punishment but understanding, felt like a rare victory. "I've put in a recommendation," she said finally. "For you." Ethan turned surprised. "For what? Lead canine integration instructor? Expanded role? More autonomy?" Her eyes held his. "You and Shadow set a standard people notice." The word standard landed heavily but not unpleasantly. Ethan thought of Yemen, of smoke and confusion, of how Shadow's teeth had latched onto his sleeve and refused to let go. "I'll think about it," he said, knowing already that he would accept. Later that morning, the training yard filled again. Candidates lined up, quieter than before, their energy focused rather than scattered. Among them was a new face, Ben Carter, 26, tall and wiry, freckles scattered across a sunburned nose, eyes bright with eagerness and uncertainty. He knelt awkwardly when Shadow approached, offering a tentative hand. Shadow sniffed, then sat tail thumping once. Ben's grin broke wide and unguarded. "He likes me," he whispered as if in church. Ethan watched the interaction with a warmth he didn't try to suppress. Teaching, he realized, wasn't about correcting mistakes alone. It was about creating moments where fear loosened its grip and something better could take hold. The session unfolded smoothly, clear commands, measured responses, discipline without humiliation. Where Logan Pierce had once tried to dominate, Ethan now emphasized cooperation. Shadow demonstrated restraint, breaking off on command, returning to heel with perfect focus. The candidates absorbed the lesson not just with their minds, but with their posture, their breathing. When it ended, applause broke out spontaneously. Ethan raised a hand, embarrassed, but he let it happen. Shadow accepted the attention stoically until someone produced a rubber ball, at which point all professionalism vanished, and he bounded off, joy incarnate. That evening, Ethan drove home along the coast road with the windows down. The sun sank low, painting the sky in amber, and rose the ocean, reflecting colors that felt almost unreal. Shadow lay in the back, exhausted and content, head resting against the door, eyes half closed. At a stoplight, Ethan caught his reflection in the mirror, scar by his eyebrow. beard, shadowed eyes clear. He didn't look like a man who had escaped danger. He looked like a man who had learned how to stay. Back at the house, Ethan knelt to remove Shadow's harness. The dog leaned into him solid and warm. "We did okay," Ethan murmured. Shadow's tail thumped once, slow and sure. Outside, the tide turned, carrying the day back out to sea. Inside, a quieter happiness settled in a promise that some endings were not losses but openings. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Walker believed it. Sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly through loyalty that refuses to let go, through courage that chooses restraint over rage, through a second chance that appears only because someone stood firm when it mattered most. If there is a miracle in this story, it is this. God often works through ordinary faithfulness, through a man who chose discipline instead of ego, through a dog whose loyalty became a shield, through truth that stood still long enough for justice to catch up. In our daily lives, we may never wear a uniform or walk a training ground by the sea, but every day we face the same choice. Will we respond with anger or with integrity? Will we walk away when it's easier or stand when it's right? And when we do choose what is right, even quietly, even unseen, that is where God's hand often moves most clearly. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. And subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need light in dark moments. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May He give you strength when the road is hard, peace when the world is loud, and courage to choose what is good, even when no one is watching. Thank you for being here.